And welcome back. So we've looked at fitting the crown rafter, that's installed, and now we're going to start looking at the hip. First thing I want to do is a bit of a sort of a recap as to how we found the true length for our common rafter, because the principles ultimately are exactly the same. So we're just going to talk about this sort of section here for now, and this is looking at the sort of gable end as such. We talked about our plumb cut for our common rafter. Where did we find that angle, Pete?
In the ready reckoner.
Perfect, yeah, that was in the ready reckoner. Once again, the ready reckoner also gave us the seat cut for the common rafter. And then from there, we could also work out the true length by calculating it in the ready reckoner. And from there, we can sort of span out and develop our hip. So, looking on sort of a plan again, I've just continued a line straight up, sort of met it with that hypotenuse for that hip there. These angles, once again, are taken from our ready reckoner. So there's nothing too technical there, just literally taking them from the book. You notice our abbreviations are changing ever so slightly. So we've got plumb cut hip rafter now, and seat cut hip rafter. So that's these angles in here. So we've discussed angles, now we'll start looking at that true length again. Exactly the same calculation that you've got in your book. We need to know our run. Nothing changes, exactly the same roof that we're working on. So our run is 500 millimeters. And if you can remember, I said it's important to transfer that into meters, so we're all working in the same unit all the time. What you will notice with the ready reckoner is it will give you a length of the hip just below where it says the length of the rafter. So that number changes ever so slightly. And what you will notice is that number is a little bit larger than the common rafter, because that distance, if I sort of swung that round, we would notice would be a little bit longer. So this number here, 1 metre 644 millimetres, I've taken exactly from the ready reckoner. The calculation is exactly the same, so our run is 0.5 metres, multiply that by that, and that's giving me 0.822. Now that is our true length. Okay, and what we're going to look at a little bit later on is how to actually plot that onto a hip. Okay, welcome back. Before we start to actually mark out our hip rafter, there's a couple of key things I want to actually look at and think about with this corner. So the first part, and I've actually labelled it part A, is I've taken a sliding bevel to the plumb cut of our common or our crown, as we know it's both the same. And I'm literally going to push that up until it strikes the edge of that wall plate and put that plumb line in. Okay? From there, I'm going to measure that. Okay? And like I said, logical thinking, I'm going to make a note of that, either on the wall plate or on the sort of rafter itself. And that will become a lot clearer when we come to mark out our hip. The second part I want to talk about is this corner here. So we know we're going to be taking out a bird's mouth out of our hip. We know as that sort of corner protrudes, it's not going to sit very well. So we need to take a square cut off the end of there to be able to take the support of that big seat cut. So how do we know how much to take out and where do we take it out from? So there's an easy way of working this out. With my combination square, I'm basically going to strike a diagonal line bisecting the two wall plates. You can see there. From there, I need to know the thickness of my hip rafter. And I'm going to, basically that is going to be the centre line there of my hip. So I'm coming half the thickness either side of that line. I'm going to square those lines down join them across the top. And that essentially is what's going to be cut off. Before I cut it off, and I cannot stress this, but importantly enough, I want you to measure that distance there. So basically the sort of square part of what we're going to cut off. Once again, good habits, write it on your wall plate. Welcome back. Okay, so now we're going to look through actually marking out the hip rafter. I've got a few marks on here, but I'm going to talk through them individually and how we get to these markings. What I've done to start with is I've put this plumb cut on the top of my rafter already to make life a little bit easier. So that once again is that angle up there. From there, I'm going to set a marking gauge to half the thickness of the hip. And what I can do then is scribe that down that angle I've already cut on there. Okay? I'm going to do that to both sides. And I'm also going to do it on the top. And what I've done there is I've basically transferred my plumb cut both sides, join that to the centre. If you remember on the previous video, that is then our compound cut for the top of the hip going into the saddle board. Okay, that's the top cut down. Now we're looking at this bird's mouth. First things first, how do I know how far down the hip to put this bird's mouth? So, looking at our calculation that we did previous, okay, that is our true length. So that is taken from our very point at the top, down the hip to a square line. From there, I'm going to stick with my plumb cut, transfer that down. Okay, so this was just working at true length for a minute. From there, we're going to look back at the previous video. We're going to find out marking A, which was 80mm. I'm going to take that from a vertical line from the top down to put a little mark. From there, I can introduce my seat cut. Drop that horizontal line in there. This now should be 90 degrees. The one final deduction that we need to think about is the second part of the video, is part A, is that distance that we've deducted from that corner with the wall plate. And thinking back to that video, as I sit that on here, you can see it's not going to sit too well on a corner, so we need to take that deduction. And like I said, logically thinking, write it on your wall plate so you don't forget it, and moving back horizontally, because we're taking it away from that wall plate, we need to take that deduction off our seat cut as well. And once again, good practice. I've squared my lines around, because if your cuts aren't square, your hip isn't going to sit square. Welcome back. Just want to explain what I've done here. So, there's one more alteration to do to our hip, and to actually work out that alteration, I find it easier to actually draw it. And what I've done here is drawn it at a 1-to-1 scale. So if you could almost imagine that flat like that, and sort of lift it up, this is where we're at. So we've got this sort of last common rafter here, our saddle board. Okay, the crown rafter, which is coming down there, the wall plates at the bottom, and this deduction here is this deduction here. The advantage of doing it as a 1-to-1 scale is any deductions that you need to take from your timber are the exact measurements. Okay, so you're not going to lose any measurements by scaling up or down. And the reason that I've done that, and more importantly, this dotted line, like we spoke about before, is with roofing, everything is true, level, plumb, crisp, accurate. In an ideal world, it will fit like a tree, okay? But the idea of this dotted line, okay, is if you are working with an imaginary line, a single line. So we're working with timber that's got a thickness to it, which is why I've expanded that line. So this hip is going to butt into our crown. Like I mentioned before, there's more than one way of actually completing a hip end. Okay? So with this one, it's going to butt into our crown. Therefore, as you can see from this drawing, we're going to have to make another alteration at the top here. All we need to do is measure down the centre of our timber, whatever distance you've got there, and that angle there, you can set sliding bevel to, and just transfer that down whatever distance you've got there. And you're basically deducting half the thickness of that crown for this to sit in. Like you can see, we had our point on our marking out, whatever that distance was, I've deducted it. A couple of little tips. I can still see all my pencil lines, so I know nothing's going to be too short. If anything, it's going to be a little bit too long, so I can still make some alterations. But the idea is when it sits in, should fit nice and clean like that. Like I said, that's in an ideal world, working with nice, crisp, accurate lines.